I'm Bobby Wrinkle and welcome you to Evening Upstairs at your library. In the wee hours of December 16, 1811, the earth began to shake in central Mississippi River Valley, and the few settlers in the region were knocked out of their bed by a roaring earthquake. At this same time, the first earthquake, the steamboat New Orleans, was making its first trip down the Mississippi. And naturalist John J. Audubon, riding his horse in the Barren region, heard a distant rumbling and felt the earth begin to shake. Our speaker tonight is Professor, Department of History, Murray State University. She holds a PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Let's welcome tonight's guest, Dr. Engineer, as she presents a discussion of the New Madrid earthquake, 1811-1812.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's really an honor to be speaking with you all today, and thanks very much to Bobby for everything that she's done to set this up. I'll start by letting you all know I'm not an expert on seismology or earthquakes. I'm an environmental historian. I mostly study disease and health and the body and how it relates to the environment. But being new to this region, I have gained an interest in studying the local history, and I hope that you all will enjoy my talk tonight. I'm going to start with talking about some of the impacts and explanations and experiences of people during the New Madrid earthquakes. Then I'll talk about how the earthquakes changed the landscape and the environment. Then I will focus on the history of Native Americans and American settlers and how they reacted to the earthquakes in the early 19th century. And then I will end by talking about how the history of these earthquakes has been forgotten and then remembered over the course of the 20th and early 21st century. So, as Bobby already said, from December of 1811 until February of 1812, there were 3 large earthquakes and numerous other earthquakes that shook this area that you all are familiar with, known as the Missouri Foothills. The main epicenters of the earthquake were around the site of New Madrid, which at the time was a pretty important Mississippi River trading port located at the junction of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. The first earthquake occurred at 2:15 a.m. on December 16th. The second was on January 13th, 1812, and the third, the largest one, was on February 7th. Between December and March, there were between 6,000 and 10,000 quakes in the region, and over 2,000 in the central Midwest. So this map that you can see here is a graphic based on newspaper reports compiled from 1811 to 1812, and it shows the intensity of people's descriptions of the earthquakes based on the MMI, or Modified Mercalli Intensity Scale. So at the lower end of the scale, from 2 to 4, which you can see here were felt all the way in Norfolk and up to Canada, the impacts are described as from weak to light, meaning that people felt some vibrations indoors. If they were on the upper floors of buildings, they felt vibrations. The more moderate impacts ranged from buildings being damaged to people being awakened in the middle of the night, and a lot of people reporting being frightened by tremors and sounds. Then, at the higher end of the scale in our region, there was extreme damage being reported. Buildings collapsing, people witnessing the ground moving in waves. And as you can see, these earthquakes were felt throughout what was then the United States. Around the epicenters of the earthquakes, at the heart of the North American continent, where the present-day states of Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois draw near each other, the impacts of the earthquakes were terrifyingly intense. The air filled with a loud noise, a foul stench of sulfur, and mysterious flashes of light. There were large areas that were covered with rising warm water, that threatened to drown many people in what's now, especially in what's now southeastern Missouri. The surface of the earth rolled in visible ground waves, so powerful that sections of the forest snapped off mid-trunk and the trees recoiled. The ground shaking caused the deep, soft soil of this vast floodplain region to separate, causing earthquake cracks that could run for almost a mile and could be anywhere from centimeters deep to many meters deep. One researcher described the earth as being of the consistency of a runny egg casserole if you took it out of the oven and shook it from side to side. In the areas near southeastern Missouri and eastern Arkansas, water just under the surface of the earth was put under tremendous pressure by the seismic movement. The water and sand under the soil in much of the Mississippi floodplain responded by liquefying and essentially turning from solid ground into volatile quicksand. This pressurized, liquefied sand shot upward as it sought an outlet, and it shot through the clay underlayer of dirt on the surface into fountains of liquefied sand, creating immense round so-called sand blows, which were volcano-like, rounded cones of white sand rising through the red clay or black dirt. This is a process known as liquefaction, and it's hard to imagine, but some people have compared it to on the beach when there's sand. If you're standing on wet sand, it seems relatively stable, but if you move your feet around, you can see the liquid oozing up through what seems like stable ground. Because of this seismic commotion, a portion of western Kentucky lurched upward, raising itself into an enormous dome that's still visible today. This uplift doesn't seem very dramatic, and people who drive through the area, and even some people who live in the area, might not notice it. But in the context of the vast flat floodplain of the Mississippi, this gentle bulge in the landscape seems peculiar and rather ominous. It was this uplift that turned the Mississippi River, the continent's central river, and caused it to run briefly but dramatically backwards until the natural current wore down these newly made falls, which I'll talk more about in a moment. Even far from the epicenters, the New Madrid earthquakes were powerful. People felt them in southern New Hampshire. They terrified settlers throughout the Ohio Valley. They awakened people sleeping on the East Coast. They rang church bells in Charleston, and they crashed furniture in the nation's capital. At the time, these disruptions were an obvious and well-remembered part of our national history. They were a set of disturbances with terrifying environmental impacts that were very apparent and very frightening. A big question that people had at the time, and that people still have today, is about exactly what happened and why it happened. And to a very large extent, we still don't know the answers to these questions. What we do know is that during these months, during the winter of 1811 to 1812, there were a series of large earthquakes with magnitudes ranging from 7 to 8.7, probably closer to 7. But we don't really know in any essential sense why these earthquakes occur. We know in the big picture a fair amount about how earthquakes work. The framework of plate tectonics, a field that was developed in the 20th century, gives us an explanation of how these tectonic plates, as they shifted, they were ripped apart a very long time ago when the Earth was when the continents formed one large supercontinent. As they ripped apart very slowly, they formed these rifts, and when these parts of the Earth rub up against each other and grind against each other, they cause the common earthquakes that we think about, like when Los Angeles moves northward towards San Francisco along the San Andreas Fault. We can understand the causes of that earthquake pretty clearly. So for people in California or Japan or in Indonesia or anywhere else that's on a plate boundary, this basic model of plates crashing and scraping against each other works well to explain the causes of earthquakes. But this model doesn't explain why there are earthquakes in the middle of tectonic plates, like in the middle of the North American plate where we're located. New Madrid is about 1,500 miles from the San Andreas Fault, and these kinds of so-called intraplate quakes are not very well explained by plate tectonics or any other model in seismology. One thing that we do know is that earthquakes can occur for many other reasons. Sometimes small local tremors are caused by deep drilling, for example. But none of our current forms of explanation alone would seem to account for the scale of the quakes in 1811 and 1812. Something big enough to make the Mississippi run backward would have to have a lot of motive force behind it, and we don't really know where all of that power came from. Recent research has shown that these quakes were not just an anomaly, that they were part of a series of earthquakes that goes back several thousand years. What's more interesting is that they seem to have occurred relatively frequently and regularly, possibly every 200 to 600 years. There are other examples in the world of intraplate quakes, recently a few in China, and figuring out more about these mechanisms and the likelihood of future similar shocks in the New Madrid region is a clear public imperative. But in any case, for North Americans in the early 19th century, it was clear that these disruptions, which were only slowly coming to be known as earthquakes, created important material changes. Changes to the land and changes to the people living on it. Not sure what is wrong with this visual, but it's an image of a boat on the Mississippi during one of the earthquakes. By February of 1812, many people in North America were aware of this series of disruptions that occurred somewhere along the edge of the growing American nation. From the upper Missouri River to upper Canada, from Georgia to Connecticut, many people felt an unsettling rocking and shaking. They heard strange sounds. They witnessed the movement of objects. They also witnessed the alarm of animals and birds. And they even felt disturbing symptoms in their own bodies. For 3 months, these events were puzzling and even frightening, and they were big news in 1812. There's one particular account that was written by a river traveler, William Lee Pierce, which was one of the most detailed and longest eyewitness accounts written at the time of the earthquakes. It was first published in February of 1812 by the Hampshire Federalist, and then it appeared in many different newspapers all across the nation. The fact that there was a lot of public interest in Pierce's narrative shows the tensions of 1812, a year when new commercial networks were spreading further across North America, as explorers sought to survey Western territories that were only recently claimed by the United States, and as a war of trade, territory, and culture was brewing between the U.S. and Britain. Here's a map of the United States in 1806. This is when the west bank of the Mississippi had just become legally American, a few short years before the earthquakes with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. This region, since the late 1600s, had been occupied by various Native American groups, and the French had worked with Native Americans to negotiate trade and mining and the establishment of small-scale French settlements in the region. After the 7 Years' War, the multinational conflict that in the U.S. was known as the French and Indian War, France ceded control of the territory to Spain in 1763, and Spanish control over this middle Mississippi region was even weaker than France's had been. In 1800, Spain ceded this area known as Louisiana to the French, under a secret agreement, and the Louisiana Territory extended from west of the Mississippi to the so-called Stony Mountains or Rocky Mountains. And soon after, American negotiators found themselves somewhat surprised to be negotiating with a weary Napoleon to purchase the territory. The Louisiana Purchase is famous in American history, but it was somewhat puzzling to leaders and Americans at the time. President Jefferson was worried that the purchase was not constitutionally sanctioned, but he proceeded anyway. And most people didn't have a clear idea of what the territory was that had changed hands. But what was clear to most people, including Native Americans, French settlers, Americans, and others, was that the area that opened out onto the Louisiana Purchase, the Middle Mississippi region, was crucial for shaping the diplomacy and trade and politics of future settlement. One of the most important concerns for Americans, both during the Louisiana Purchase and during later conflicts, including the War of 1812, was to keep the commerce flowing. One of the first acts of the Americans when they possessed Louisiana was to lift trade restrictions that were imposed by the Spanish. So, in 1811, the year that William Lee Pierce's convoy was descending the river, people across the Atlantic looked with anticipation and anxiety to the British asserting control over the Mississippi Valley and its commerce. William Lee Pierce was part of a convoy of shallow-bottomed boats that was taking goods from Pittsburgh down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi, to the international trading port of New Orleans at the end of 1811. He would have been traveling on a flatboat like the one pictured here when the first shocks of the New Madrid earthquakes hit on December 16th. William Lee Pierce was part of the second generation of the United States. His mother was a planter in Carolina. His father fought in the American Revolution. And his father was also a delegate of the Constitutional Convention that formed the framework of the nation. On the night that the first of the three major shocks hit, his convoy happened to be anchored off of the small community of Big Prairie, a little below the trading town of New Madrid. Once he reached New Orleans, he mailed off a long narrative of his journey, which traced the effects of the earthquakes in the middle and lower Mississippi. I'm going to read you a short excerpt from his account describing the first major shock on December 16th. He wrote, quote, "Precisely at 2 o'clock in the morning, the 16th instant, we were all alarmed by the violent and convulsive agitation of the boats, accompanied by a noise similar to that which would have been produced by running over a sandbar. Every man was immediately roused and rushed upon deck. We were first of opinion that the Indians, studious of some mischief, had loosened our cables, and thus situated we were foundering. Upon examination, however, we discovered we were yet safely and securely moored. The idea of an earthquake then suggested itself to my mind, and this idea was confirmed by a second shock and two others in immediate succession. These continued for the space of 8 minutes. So complete and general had been the convulsion that a tremendous motion was communicated to the very leaves on the surface of the earth. A few yards from the spot where we lay, a body of large oak was snapped in two, and the falling part precipitated to the margin of the river. The trees in the forest shook like rushes. The alarming clattering of their branches may be compared to the effect which would have been produced by a severe wind passing through a large canebrake." What's interesting about Pierce's account is that he immediately figured out that he had experienced an earthquake. It's less surprising that initially he thought that he was being attacked by Indians. In the winter of 1811, international and cross-cultural tensions were high. The US and Britain were on the verge of war for control of these very waterways that Pierce was traveling on, among other things. At the same time, a native confederacy based in the upper Ohio Valley, led by the brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, threatened to ally with the British to retake control of key lands of American commerce and settlement. In a huge coincidence, the first steamboat to travel the Mississippi, the New Orleans, was also underway when the first of the new Madrid quakes struck. Like the other boats on the Mississippi, passengers on the New Orleans were terrified by the quakes. On board the New Orleans were Nicholas Roosevelt and his wife, Lydia Latrobe Roosevelt, their young toddler son, their dogs, and their team of servants. Nicholas Roosevelt was the brother of Theodore Roosevelt's great-grandfather. He was an inventor and an engineer, and with the help of investors, he designed and manufactured this first steamboat, the New Orleans. He wanted to demonstrate the practical and commercial possibilities of steam-powered shipping on the Mississippi. Like Pierce's fleet, the New Orleans left from Pittsburgh. While it was stopped in Louisville, Lydia gave birth to their second son, and about 2 weeks later, while they were anchored in Ohio, they felt the tremendous shock of the first earthquake of 1811. Lydia Roosevelt described it as feeling like they had suddenly run aground. The rest of their journey was intense. They voyaged across a landscape that was flooding and being constantly transformed by earthquakes. But throughout their journey, the steamboat did not founder. The smoke and the loud sounds of the steamboat were combined with smoke and tremors from the earth. And finally, the steamer made it successfully down to New Orleans, the city that it was named after. This journey was really powerful in proving the power of steam to overcome natural forces in ways that flatboats like Pierce's could not. So I'm sorry that my images are cut off a little bit strangely, but here you can see an image of the scene of flatboats on the Mississippi. The morning of December 16th, people across the country experienced their ordinary lives in commotion. Since the first earthquake hit late at night, around 2:15 in the morning, people who were awake were engaged in quiet activities like reading. And many people, especially those that were far from the epicenters, noticed paintings or mirrors or curtains swaying. They noticed bells and clocks tolling unaccountably. Some people felt lurching, jerky sensations. One householder described being awakened to horrible squawking and thought someone was trying to steal her turkeys and chickens in the middle of the night. Another man woke up during the shocks and recounted that he didn't think it was an earthquake, but that either the house was haunted or the end of the world was at hand. These sensations were very strange to those in the region as they struggled to make sense of them. They reached for familiar metaphors. One traveler in the Creek Nation felt the earthquake's motion as, quote, similar to a cradle rocking from one side to the other. John J. Audubon, who was in Kentucky, wrote that the earth waved like a field of corn before the breeze. Others noted that they felt like they were on a ship at sea. And as people experienced these shocks, they struggled to figure out what was happening. And this struggle continued over those months, and in some ways it still continues as people try to piece together why these earthquakes happened in the first place. So as you can see in this illustration of the Mississippi River in the middle of the earthquakes, the river had become a maelstrom. There were huge waves that sloshed small boats. Riverbanks collapsed. Long buried trees floated to the earth's surface. And whole islands in the Mississippi disappeared. For weeks, travelers reported seeing debris of wrecked watercraft floating downstream. One of the most alarming and startling effects of the earthquakes was the result of the February 7th shock, which actually forced the Mississippi River to flow backwards. All of the shocks had a powerful effect on the river's current. In 1811 and 1812, the Mississippi was a broad river, and the powerful tremors underneath, around, and through its waters caused waves to move back and forth, amplifying and interacting as they bounced off the riverbanks. It was this large-scale sloshing that destroyed the riverbanks and smashed many other boats into pieces. But in an even more dramatic way, the earthquakes affected the Mississippi by creating temporary waterfalls. A pair of travelers who passed through New Madrid on their way to Lexington gave an account of the February 7th shock, reporting that, quote, some obstruction had presented itself in the river, something like a rapids or falls, which greatly endangered the navigation. This disruption of the Mississippi River created an uplift known as the Tiptonville Dome. I think it's on my next slide here. Sorry. Here's an image of the Tiptonville Dome. It's an uplift of what was formerly flat alluvial plain that stretched from western Tennessee across to the Mississippi. It's a relatively unremarkable dome, except in comparison to the flat land surrounding it. It was this uplift that blocked the clear flow of the river and forced much of its water back upstream. The flow that didn't make it over the uplift swiftly eroded the soft soil so that the main current continued downstream for a very short time. So this backwards flow lasted only a few hours. The falls lasted for a few days and ended up ruining several flatboats. For those that experienced the tumultuous and backward current, the power of the Earth's movement was spectacular. A river traveler who experienced this firsthand reported that, quote, there was a back current in the river which drove the boat several miles up a small bayou, and during the convulsion, the motion of the boat was so violent as to pierce many barrels of flour on the boat. After 3 days of quaking, he abandoned his goods and left the area and went back east. He and other dazed travelers would report these events, and at the time they were regarded as true witnesses of the earthquakes. But by the end of the 19th century, when there was no longer clear visible evidence of the obstructions to the flow of the Mississippi, people started to regard these sorts of stories as fanciful tall tales. However, at the time, it was clear that the earthquake had changed the topography and the nature of the region. Many observers noticed extensive topographic changes to the landscape. One Methodist preacher near the epicenters described a night of horrors. He wrote, one shock following another, the solid ground ran in waves, resembling those on the face of a lake. He also described in detail the changes to the area around New Madrid. He wrote, shocks tore the earth asunder, changing the face of the country, raising lakes to dry land, turning timbered lands into wet and swamplands, and throwing level, beautiful prairies into mounds and deep chasms. Areas around New Madrid were sunk down by the radical shifting of the earth during the main shocks of the quakes. Likewise, areas to the south, especially along the St. Francis River, you can see, this is an image before the earthquakes, so you can see the St. Francis River here, and then after the earthquakes here. These areas south of New Madrid were subsided and created what are now known as the sunk lands of northeast Arkansas. In the early 19th century, people saw these changes as evidence of the earthquakes, but later in the 20th century, they would be reinterpreted by geologists and others as ordinary processes due to flooding and swamp overflow. And I'll be talking more about these misinterpretations at the end of today's talk. So you might be able to see in this map of the region before the earthquake that it was populated with Native American settlements. It was a region that was active in trade with Shawnee villages and was a well-traveled conduit for settlement, travel, and commerce. It was an active center of trade in animal pelts, lead, and other valuables, including a U.S. postal route. After the earthquakes, as you can see, the earthquakes lifted up portions of the terrain, created sunk lands, covered the area with wide sand blows, and stopped the free flow of the St. Francis River system. What had previously been an important flowing conduit became an impassable swamp. Trade and travel could no longer go up and down the river, and the former U.S. postal route had to be remade in order to bypass what was called the Great Swamp here next to Reelfoot Lake. Native American settlers ended up fleeing westward and southward, and soon their very existence in these flooded lands would be forgotten. These maps, or this map especially on the right, outlines what we know as clearly documented changes to the environment, but it's likely that changes to the land were even larger. The earthquakes formed extensive lakes around their epicenters. A missionary explained both the extent and the confusion of this environmental transformation. His name was Timothy Flint. He wrote, quote, "The whole country, to the mouth of the Ohio in one direction and to the St. Francis in the other, included a front of 300 miles, was convulsed to such a degree as to create lakes and islands, the number of which is not yet known." And in fact, the number of lakes created by the earthquakes is still not known. A lot of maps of the state of Missouri in the early 19th century indicate large lakes in the southeastern corner that don't appear in later maps. So some of these earthquake lakes apparently became less visible and present because of erosion, wind erosion, water erosion, as well as the overgrowth of vegetation. Other lakes were drained in the extensive swamp reclamation projects of the late 19th century and early 20th century, which completely remade the landscape of these areas south of New Madrid. There was one significant and lasting body of water created by the large shock of February 7th. This is the same tremor that caused the Mississippi River to flow backwards. The rising land, the Tiptonville Dome, impounded Reelfoot Creek, which was a largish creek at the time, and formed Reelfoot Lake. The earthquakes essentially dammed the creek, creating a very shallow but extensive body of water. In the words of the Tennessee State Parks Department, Reelfoot Lake is a shallow, flooded forest. You all probably know it's a popular recreational area now, similar to the sunk lands of Arkansas. It's a main fishing attraction where companies will rent out special shallow-bottomed boats that are adapted in navigating this area where cypress trees stick out of the surface of the water. So for people closest to the epicenters, the earthquakes were devastating and life-changing. Here's a map to give you an idea of exactly where the temporary falls, which lasted a few hours, were. And at the time, we have a lot of evidence of reactions of white and French Creole settlements in this region, but gradually we've been learning more about how Native American communities experienced these quakes. As I said, the region of the Middle Mississippi was an active center of trade and networking between Cherokees, Delawares, Shawnees, and French Creoles and American settlers. The consequences of the earthquakes included both spiritual upheaval and physical dislocation. In April of 1912, Chief Gomo of the Illinois River, Potawatomis, contemplated the tremors that had rocked his people's territory. He concluded that, quote, "The Great Spirit is angry and wants us to return ourselves and live in peace." The reason for his anger was clear as well. As Chief Gomo put it, many children have sold their lands, and the Great Spirit did not give them lands to sell. Across many parts of North America, Native American communities regarded the New Madrid earthquakes as powerful spiritual signs. From the upper Missouri River to the southeastern woodlands, many Indians interpreted the quakes as a sign of the anger of the Great Spirit because of the loss of Indian culture and Indian lands. The earthquakes gave force to two major movements, among others. One is the political and cultural confederation among the Shawnee, led by Tecumseh and his brother, and then also a religious revival movement among the Cherokees. While Tecumseh is not central to all of these movements, his history is central to why they're all important. If most Americans know anything about the New Madrid quakes, it's likely some version of a story of Tecumseh's rise as a political and cultural leader. He was speaking to tribes that he hoped to recruit into an anti-American alliance, and he prophesied that after he returned home, he would cause the earth to shake as a sign of the truth of his words and the power of his movement. This is a vague and romanticized story which portrays Tecumseh as the leader of all of the Native American tribes and his spiritual call as unique. But in truth, these stories involving Tecumseh and his brother were the most widespread among a number of other similar stories which had united Native American groups across much of eastern North America in the preceding decades. The New Madrid earthquakes affected many of the chief groups that were living across the eastern woodlands of North America, including Shawnees and other Algonquin speakers in the upper Ohio Valley, Cherokees who had over several generations drawn back from their traditional homelands in the Smoky Mountains into the North Georgia headwaters of the Tennessee River, also Creeks who resided further south and west along the Gulf of Mexico coastal plains, and Seminoles who were gathering strength in the panhandle of Spanish Florida. On the night of the first shock in mid-December, Christian missionaries who were living among the Cherokees in what's now northwestern Georgia recorded that, quote, houses shook and everything in them moved while chickens fell from their roosts and set up a frightful crying. These continued tremors darkened wells, created sinkholes, and rocked buildings. There was a similar disruption felt in other Native American home territories. Like their American contemporaries, Indians who were shaken by the quakes were scared, but they were also fascinated and curious. They sought to compare their experiences and local reports to evaluate the extent of the sensation and damage, and to figure out exactly what happened. In Native American communities, people across the continent heard the quakes as a call to repentance. They felt jolted by God and proclaimed repentance or sought revival. The New Madrid earthquakes had different meanings in Indian country than they did in the physically overlapping but culturally distinct American states and territories. Unlike Americans, Native peoples came to understand the earthquakes through their political and cultural struggles against being dislocated from their land. Many Indians saw the tremors as the anger of the Great Spirit that they described variously as the mother of the nation, the divine spirit, or the maker of breath, and they resolved to turn back to traditional ways and traditional lands. We can see this mindset in reports from the upper Missouri River. One report by Edwin James, who was a scientific officer on Major Stephen H. Long's expedition to the Rocky Mountains in 1819, reported that the earthquakes had caused widespread superstitious dread. He explained that the Missouri Indians believed earthquakes to be an effect of supernatural agency like the thunder, with the immediate operations of the master of life. Across much of native North America, there are similar stories that frame the earthquakes as a divine reaction to American violence against the Indians. They're repeated, and the story conveys anger at the crimes of Americans against the Indians, but also anger at the Indians for failing to stop the Americans or failing to react against them. In other words, the Great Spirit was understood to be speaking to native peoples through disturbances in the earth. There was a second major movement among Native Americans in the Cherokee heartland. At the time, they were a vast nation. They occupied the southeast North American woodlands. And for the Cherokees, 1811 marked a period of political consolidation. They were in the face of intense cultural, political, and military pressure. In the decades after the American Revolution, they had been forced from an extensive territory, once centered around the Smoky Mountains, into a reduced area of what's now northeastern Georgia, with portions of Alabama, Tennessee, and North Carolina. In 1808, American efforts to force a treaty resulted in the contentious departure of a sizable faction of Cherokees to settlements west of the Mississippi. Those who stayed in the Cherokee homeland sought to repair rifts within the Cherokee Nation, and factions that had been long divided reunited as the Cherokee Nation consolidated. The Cherokees faced a lot of challenges in 1811 in addition to these political struggles. Their economy was under stress, they lost access to a lot of lands, they experienced a severe famine, they experienced a disease outbreak among their horses. There were a lot of newcomers, white Americans especially, flooding into their territory. So in a lot of ways, they were at a spiritual and political turning point. So the result was a wave of prophetic visions, spiritual fervor, and community revival among the Cherokees. And this movement began early in 1811 and became more intense after the earthquakes. At first, the movement was expressed as a spiritual reaction against white ways and customs and manners. The movement offered new practices as traditional rituals and dances and festivals had fallen out of practice. So many of the Indian communities had been jarred by the earthquake shocks, and the earthquakes sparked spiritual and cultural revival movements based on the renewal of traditional ways and resistance to American pressures. Despite important differences in the ways that these movements played out among different Native American peoples, they were all simultaneously political and cultural reactions to American influence. In contrast, in American communities of Black and white people, earthquake shocks jolted people into awareness of their own individual sins or relationship with God, and prompted them to repent and commit themselves to a Christian life. The New Madrid earthquake sparked many Americans' participation in the movement of Christian spiritual renewal that they called the Great Revival, that some historians call the Second Great Awakening. Just as in Cherokee towns, in American frontier settlements, powerful community gatherings and shared rituals supported people undergoing this spiritual revival. There are a lot of important parallels that unite the ways in which people across North America experienced and interpreted the meaning of the quakes. People across many communities feared for their relationship with the Almighty, the Great Spirit or the Holy Spirit, and they sought to repair it. Early American frontier settlers reached to spiritual metaphors to make sense of the shock of the earthquakes. The ways in which 19th century Americans understood the links between the spirit and the mind and the body is quite different from our current modern medical understandings. To them, the bodily experience, the bodily sensation that they felt, was central to understanding the earthquakes on an intellectual as well as a spiritual level. People described in detail the profound ways in which their bodies reacted to the quakes. The tremors made their bodies feel unwell, disturbed, and strange. They were seized by jolts and shocks. Earthquakes were experienced as personal manifestations of ill health and imbalance. The physical shocks of the quakes gave the tremors spiritual power for many in early America. As their bodies were moved, so too were their souls. For many people, the tremors felt like electricity, like the overwhelming power of God. In newspapers, in private correspondence, and in public magazines across North America, there were reports of strange bodily sensations or disturbing bodily experiences. People described and quantified and compared the kinds and levels of sensations that they felt to create communal knowledge about the earthquakes. They worried about the impacts of the earthquakes on their bodies, and they used these metaphors of the body to think about changes in the earth. In account after account, people considered the repeated jarring dislocation of the earth as a set of weird and disturbing bodily symptoms. One woman woke up to tremors in the middle of the night and wrote that she had a strange sensation as if she was suffocating, and she leapt out of bed fearing that her house was on fire. A group of women in Canada that were on an upper story of a building complained for days after the earthquake that they still felt an uneasy sensation in their heads. People would write about these experiences as feeling a sudden and deadly sickness, or a feeling of giddiness in the head, or nausea in their stomachs. In fact, nausea was a common symptom. People described feeling dizziness and vertigo. They compared the feeling of the earthquake to being drunk, or being seasick, or like being on shipboard in a heavy swell of sea. These bodily experiences shaped spiritual reactions to the earthquakes. Just as they did for Native Americans at the time, the jolts of the earthquakes acted as a jolt for the soul, prompting reflection and repentance and revival. Earthquakes were shocking to the senses. Tremors and sensations, having these fits of being strange to oneself, feeling shocks and jolts, these experiences connected moments of spiritual truth with the physical surprise of being overtaken by an earthquake. Fascination with the flow and sensations of electricity helped give a vocabulary to the combination of bodily crisis and environmental crisis of the earthquakes. The New Madrid earthquakes fed people's fears about the individual crisis within their bodies and a more global crisis of sorts, fears of the end of the world. The quakes strengthened the movement of individual spiritual rebirth and collective faith gatherings, and the physical experience of God's truth. These experiences were registered as evidence of the profound spiritual significance of the earthquakes. This is seen not only in the way people wrote about the earthquakes, but also in songs. Community singing was a bedrock of spiritual life in the 19th century. And widely sung hymns, along with stories from the Bible, provided the basis for people's understanding of what was happening when they felt the earth shake. There were several hymns written about the New Madrid earthquakes, and they reveal a lot about the fears people had of earthquakes in the 19th century and their hopes of revival and salvation. The hymns about the New Madrid earthquakes reflect the fear and disruption of the quakes, and in particular the spiritual meaning of the roaring noises and spiritual commotion. The deep underground roar and booming, frequently heard by earthquake-rocked people, made them think that their souls were in danger. Many of them called this sound the thunder of hell. And amplifying this loud and dreadful noise was the sulfurous smell that filled the air around the earthquake's epicenters. The stench of sulfur, especially in combination with burning lights and cracks in the earth, had a practical and intensely symbolic meaning. Sulfur smell was important to the world of the 19th century. It was a common reason why spring water was not palatable or drinkable, yet at the same time sulfur had healing powers. Water from sulfur springs or bathing in sulfur springs was a potent medicine that people thought could heal. This characteristic sulfur rotten egg smell makes sense when we think about the physical causes of the earthquakes. Under the earth, there's a lot of decomposing organic matter that is without much oxygen, and when it's suddenly brought to the surface, huge areas can reek of sulfur. So, to 19th century Americans living on the frontier, this stink of sulfur combined with the terrifying roar of underground thunder represented the threat of damnation. To them, the devil also smells like burning sulfur, and thus evidence from the New Madrid quakes seemed to speak of a world in which forces of evil, represented by foul and threatening sensory experiences, could suddenly burst forth from underground. The cracks and chasms of the quakes had other symbolic meanings in addition to representing an undeniable material danger, especially the image of being swallowed by the earth. An evangelist and writer, Timothy Flint, reported that the cracks around the destroyed village of Little Prairie, or reported about the cracks around the destroyed village of Little Prairie. He wrote, "The chasms in the earth were of an extent to swallow up not only men, but houses, down quick to the pit." His readers would have been familiar to a great extent with the language and the stories in the King James Bible, and they would have immediately understood this reference. These kinds of interpretations were widely and vividly present. The upheaval of repeated earthquakes would be frightening in any cultural context, but they carried a particular resonance in the culture of 19th century America, where earthquakes were a familiar form of God's judgment through history, and where sinners were threatened with being swallowed into an abyss, and where the devil actually lives underground. Running out of time a little bit, so I want to move to some conclusions so we have time for questions. As you can tell from my talk, in the early 19th century, the New Madrid earthquakes came under intense discussion in many places by many people. But by the end of the 19th century, they had almost disappeared from public and popular knowledge and scientific investigation. The disappearance of local knowledge about the earthquakes reflected the actual sinking and submergence of the land itself. Earlier, I mentioned that the history of the New Madrid earthquakes was lost in the late 19th and early 20th century. By the end of the 19th century, some local observers and many commentators elsewhere in the country had begun to question what was once obvious environmental knowledge, that it was earthquakes that caused the land to sink. Scientific researchers and advocates of settlement in these so-called sunken lands argued that the lowlands and flooding was a natural feature of the landscape, that it was unrelated to any earthquakes. They actually argued that there had been little change in the land and that it had always been a swampy backwater. In an 1883 meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, one of the main speakers, James McFarland, argued that the earthquake was a mere legend. From the Civil War until the late 20th century, knowledge of the sunk lands and that the earthquakes created the sunk lands was both forgotten and denied. Technological enthusiasts saw the swampy, fertile land as ripe for drainage and reclamation. There were a few researchers that looked for environmental and textual evidence of the quakes. One really important one is Myron Fuller of the U.S. Geological Survey. He published an account based on written histories and his own photography showing environmental change in the region. But at the same time, engineers were draining and dredging the land around the epicenters of the New Madrid region and redefining them as not being epicenters at all. By the middle of the 20th century, drainage canals, irrigation districts, and large-scale agriculture had flattened, regularized, and imposed a new geometry in the New Madrid seismic zone, effectively erasing evidence of the quakes. It was much later, gradually starting in the 1970s and gaining momentum in the 1990s, that mainstream researchers came to re-examine the evidence of these quakes. They started to reevaluate texts like William Lee Pierce's account that I read earlier, and they started looking at accounts like that and matching them with geological investigations of stream beds and sand blows. So here's a map that shows the earthquakes that have occurred recently between 1974 and 2002 that had magnitudes larger than 2.5 using modern instruments. This is based on a study conducted at the University of Memphis. And these green circles on the map denote earthquakes that occurred prior to 1974. So in recent years, at the bicentennial of the quakes, the professional consensus has warned us of the possibility of very large future quakes. And I'll close with this image from the U.S. Geological Survey. It's a map of national seismic hazard sites. And as you can see, second to California, also around Charleston, the New Madrid seismic zone is one of the most hazardous areas in this country. I'll stop there and take any questions.
Do you know how many deaths were associated with the major quakes?
Do I know how? I don't know exactly how many deaths. The region around New Madrid was a lot less populated than now, so I think it was about 3,000 people, but I can't tell you the exact number of deaths. Sorry.
I work with the Kincaid Mounds area across the river from Paducah, and we have 8 of these sand blow areas within a mile of the mounds. So you've got those right across the river from you here at Paducah. And one of them is actually, well, looks like it came, the last earthquakes were, what, 900 AD, 1450 AD, and 1811. And one of these, we have our land surveyed into square miles, so they run these section lines, and in 1806, they ran right into one of these. It's 5 years before the 1811 earthquake. So some of these that we have over there are from an earlier earthquake than New Madrid.